glory, fame, and a place in history had been King Henry VIII's passionate aim since the earliest days of his boyhood, and both his grandmother and tutors had helped to make the 1513 conquest of France nothing less than a consuming fixation for him. Having been raised on stories of the Holy Grail and the stirring tales of Lancelot, Galahad, Tristram and Percival, his later reading of Malory, Caxton and Froissart was all of English kings waging war on French soil. And though the social order of the Middle Ages was rapidly waning, he readily immersed himself in the chivalric code of selfless heroism, which still held sway throughout the courts of Europe. The king's fondness for chivalry had also been reinforced by his father, who created him Earl Marshal at the age of 3. Indeed, Henry VII's court had consciously imitated the Burgundian model, which interpreted honour in stridently martial terms. It was no accident, therefore, that a succession of English kings were portrayed at Richmond Palace like bold and valiant knights, rather than in the customary regal panoply. And it was no coincidence either that Henry VII's successor would always conduct his ceaseless quest for name, fame, honour and renown in the shadow of these warrior ancestors who had looked down upon him since childhood from the high walls of his Richmond home. In due course, foreign visitors and courtiers alike would remark upon the young king's devotion to the joust and other military pursuits, and predicted that he would renew the name of Henry V. But it was not enough to be the most valiant prince under heaven in his own age. He was also determined to be the most goodliest prince that had ever reigned over the realm of England. And in this respect, as in almost every other, Henry felt his closest competitor to be the victor of Agincourt, who he consciously took on as his role model. That was none other than Henry V. In light of all this, it was Wolsey who had delivered young Henry that taste of glory he so craved for the very first time in his early reign. And so, by 1515, Wolsey had reached penultimate power. It was probably the happiest year of his life. Clad in his famous scarlet attire, he was now a cardinal of the Catholic Church, meaning he was more important than the Archbishop of Canterbury in England. Shortly afterwards, his accession to the office of Lord High Chancellor of England had made him the most powerful statesman in the kingdom, besides King Henry VIII himself. The previous Chancellor, William Warham, finally retired from the council to allow Wolsey to take his place. Upon his resignation, Warham would warn Henry not to suffer the servant to be greater than the master. But the passage of time had made the aging cleric increasingly inflexible and bad-tempered, and he argued with even the gentlest of people, including Queen Catherine. In fact, he had few or no friends, and it was now time for him to go, with or without Wolsey's assistance. Wolsey had begun his 14 years of power. Throughout his 14 long years as Lord Chancellor, Thomas Wolsey would be guided in his conduct by two principles above all others. On one hand, he would always believe that to govern was to dominate. Supremely confident of his own ability, he felt neither the need to delegate nor the inclination to consult. At the same time, however, he was equally convinced that high office could never be exercised effectively unless it was duly reinforced by continual displays of pomp and splendour. On neither of these things would Wolsey ever compromise. Because of this, it can be said that no subject of the crown in the whole course of English history ever left so deep an impression of power, magnificence and conceit upon their contemporaries. In 1516, Henry's dream to reconquer France had faded as the death of Ferdinand II gave way to his successor, Charles V, who immediately sought peace with the French. Charles V had inherited rule over Spain and was also the Holy Roman Emperor, alongside holding the Netherlands, then known as the Low Countries. Charles ruled a substantial portion of Europe, and English influence became limited on the continent. But Wolsey managed to assert English influence by other means. In 1517, Pope Leo X sought peace in Europe to form a crusade against the Ottoman Empire. In 1518, Wolsey was made papal legate in England, enabling him to realise Leo's desire for peace by organising the Treaty of London, a non-aggression pact of universal peace across Europe. The treaty showed Wolsey as the arbiter of Europe, organising a massive peace summit involving 20 nations. This put England at the forefront of European diplomacy and drew her out of isolation, making her a desirable ally. One of the Pope's diplomats of that time, in 1517, wrote that Wolsey, by reason of his excellent qualities, governs everything alone, so that foreign envoys fancy themselves negotiating not with a cardinal, but with another king. 2 years later, it was said that Wolsey is in very great repute, 7 times greater than if he were Pope. Yet to others, the most striking thing about the Lord Chancellor was always his inordinate vanity. In the opinion of Marino Sanuto, for example, he remained the proudest prelate that ever breathed, and even that most loyal of servants, George Cavendish, would be unable to deny ultimately that his master was the haughtiest man in all his proceedings that then lived. This can be seen with Wolsey's boastful splendour. He would often be witnessed in an extravagant procession where 2 great crosses of silver were held on high in front of him, the first symbolising the power of the papal legate, the second representing the office of archbishop. The 2 heavy pillars of state followed close behind him, along with the Lord Chancellor's own sergeant-at-arms and a bare-headed page, especially chosen for his exceptional beauty, who carried the Great Seal of England in a silk purse. Then came Wolsey himself, alongside a scarlet-clad mule, with 4 footmen holding gilt poleaxes, and either a peer or a gentleman usher reverently carrying his cardinal's hat. Meanwhile, as the whole party made its stately way through crowds of onlookers, other gentlemen ushers helped to clear the path. "On, my lords and masters," the cry went up. "Make way for my Lord's Grace, the Cardinal Legate of York, Lord High Chancellor of this realm." Wolsey's triumph at the Treaty of London was to be short-lived. The European powers were not showing signs of lasting unification to resist the Ottoman threat, and the political landscape began falling back to its previous state of conflict. In a last-ditch response to salvage his crumbling universal peace, Wolsey devised a plan to host a spectacular and lavish summit, called the Field of the Cloth of Gold, in 1520. It was a meeting between the 2 young kings, the King of France, Francis I, and Henry VIII. The elaborate event was intended to try to reinforce the pledge for universal peace and friendship between France and England, and be a magnificent spectacle of chivalry that Henry would greatly enjoy. Both Henry and Francis wished to be seen as Renaissance princes. Renaissance thinking held that a strong ruler could choose peace from a place of strength. The meeting was designed to show how magnificent each court was, and how this could be a basis for mutual respect and peace between states that were traditional enemies. Cardinal Wolsey and Thomas More had successfully persuaded Henry that a treaty and outlook with humanist principles, creating European solidarity, would bring him more prestige than fighting a war that would cost lots of money. It was hoped that the momentous event would mark an end to almost 2 centuries of animosity between England and France. Francis's ascension to the French throne in 1515 might have heralded a new chapter, but Henry saw Francis as a nobody who was merely squatting on his throne. The atmosphere was tense right up until the actual meeting. The gold coats worn by the English party were briefly mistaken for armour, and all was paused until the French were reassured that Francis was in no danger. Then the kings doffed their caps and embraced each other as if old friends. It was said that every knight of the Christian world would be invited to show his prowess with sword and lance. Everything about the event was designed to conjure up a long-vanished chivalric past. The summit took place in a valley, which was specially landscaped so neither camp was situated higher above the other. Wolsey too was eager for his share of the limelight. It was suggested by Polydore Virgil that he longs like a peacock to display his many-adorned tail, that is, to exhibit his special appearance in the land of France. 12 chaplains, 50 gentlemen and 237 servants were to travel with him, in comparison to the 140 men apiece allocated to the 2 dukes that would be making the journey and the mere 70 allowed for Archbishop Warham. But more than this, the cardinal would be at the centre of events, wining, dining, easing, dealing, confiding, advising, posing and charming, as occasion required. Both monarchs sought to outdo the other in terms of the grandness of their plans. This, after all, was as much a contest as a reconciliation, an opportunity to flaunt, assert and confirm the superiority of one realm over another. Some 5,172 English men and women had been transported across the Channel before the end of May with all their requirements for a full month. The king's immense entourage eventually numbered 3,997 people on its own, including the Archbishop of Canterbury and 5 bishops, 2 dukes, 1 marquess, 10 earls and 20 barons, not to mention 200 members of his household guard. In all, provisions costing £8,831 and a further £1,568 for wine and beer were duly assembled at Calais, and every last culinary detail was personally overseen by Wolsey, from the ordering of 700 conger eels, 2,014 sheep, 26 dozen heron and a bushel of mustard, right down to the purchase of cream for the king's cakes. At the same time, a countless number of other details, great and small, all came under Wolsey's personal supervision. The most meticulous attention was given to the task of safely transporting 2,865 horses across the Channel, including the particularly hefty Neapolitan breed, which English knights preferred for jousting. The steel mill at Greenwich was to be dismantled and set up at Guisnes Castle, which the English had decided to use as their base. And Wolsey also arranged for the erection of a suitably splendid palace of brick and timber to serve as the king's temporary lodging during his stay. In the event, the additional plan for a banqueting house was abandoned in favour of a vast, highly ornate tent. However, the portable makeshift palace itself, which was distinguished by the amount of glass and stained glass in it, would still include 3 chambers for the king on the first floor, the largest of which was more spacious than the White Hall at Westminster. Measuring 124 feet in length, 42 feet in width, and 27 feet in height, it was adjoined by an 80-foot dining room and withdrawing room covering some 1,620 feet. Each chamber, meanwhile, was to be hung with cloth of gold, embroidered with pearls and fine jewels, emblazoned with Tudor roses and portcullises, and lit by 1,000 candles. It required almost 6,000 men to erect such an impressive structure. Made from timber and covered in a canvas material, painted to emulate real stone, one could easily be fooled from a distance into thinking it was in fact a real palace. In the courtyard outside, streams of wine would flow from a fountain bearing statues of Cupid and Bacchus. Even Leonardo da Vinci himself, according to one Italian, could not have surpassed the design of the palace, while another, not without some justification, compared it to the fairy tale palaces of Ariosto's Orlando Furioso. The state apartments would be equipped with Turkish carpets, chairs of estate and gold and silver plate, brought across from Greenwich and Richmond by the Lord Chamberlain's men. For the chapel, meanwhile, bejewelled vestments, canopies and chalices were to be transported specially from Westminster Abbey. Such indeed was the scale of effort involved that England virtually emptied its shores of carpenters, builders, masons, glaziers and artists, as preparations reached a climax in late April and May. During the events, Francis experienced an unexpected defeat at the hands of an English knight named Weston Brown, suffering a slight wound and momentary humiliation in the process. While the carefully established rules of the tournament stated that the 2 kings would not compete against each other, Francis managed to defeat Henry in an impromptu wrestling contest suggested by the English king after a few drinks had been drank. Losing the match, Henry then challenged Francis to an archery competition, which he won, as his longbow proved too heavy for Francis to draw. On 24th of June, after many lavish days and nights of celebration, the summit had reached its conclusion, and Cardinal Wolsey assembled a great crowd in order to say Mass. At the end of the service, a great awe-inspiring dragon was sent flying through the air. This great kite combined the salamander emblem of Francis I with the Welsh Tudor dragon, and was flown to signify the end of the meeting. For all its lavish posturing and extravagance, the Field of the Cloth of Gold did not mark a new era of reconciliation between England and France. It did, however, bring Wolsey and Henry yet closer together in both trust and friendship. Not long after the event, England was to ally with Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, who declared war on France later that year. In circa 1545, more than 20 years after the extraordinary meeting, Henry VIII is supposed to have commissioned an oil painting of the events. The artist or artists is unknown. Painted so long after the event, it is filled with inaccuracies, but it still gives an idea of the scale and the number of people involved. After the collapse of Wolsey's peace policy, which had positioned England and himself as the arbiter of Europe, it became necessary for Wolsey to have a foreign policy favouring Charles V. This was what Henry VIII wanted, as he still desired to take the French crown and pursue his belief in an ancient claim on France. But England was not ready for a large-scale invasion of Europe and was effectively broke after high spending in recent years. Wolsey knew this and intended to delay war for as long as possible, leading to a policy of delay. He knew that peace, at least temporarily, was needed to prevent England engaging in a conflict it could not afford, whilst also satisfying Henry superficially with a powerful imperial alliance with Charles. And so Henry hurried away after the Cloth of Gold to negotiate a secret alliance with Francis's enemy. In a world of clockwork diplomacy where subterfuge, suspicion and tawdry self-interest were the norm, how could things have ever been otherwise? War had already begun between Francis and Charles, and both wished to make Henry their ally. At the outbreak of war in 1521, Wolsey referred to the terms of his 1518 Treaty of London, calling for talks to prevent the spilling of Christian blood. He claimed that he did not want to abandon the peace cause. Despite this, to Henry, France was the natural enemy of England, and Wolsey had to conform to his master's wishes for an alliance with the Emperor. Henry openly declared his intention to recover land in France, and stated that French aggression against his natural ally in 1521 gave him cause to intervene. This would lead to the Second English invasion of France. After the war had begun, England signed the secret Treaty of Bruges in late 1521. It was an alliance between Henry and Charles V and agreed a 1-year delay in sending an English army to France, so the English could save money and gain prestige. Wolsey deftly managed to secure diplomatic concessions from both sides, as both wanted England's support, and delay the onset of England's direct involvement in the conflict. The talks with Charles were followed up by a state visit by the Emperor to Kent, which again Wolsey was responsible for arranging. Whilst not on the scale of the Field of the Cloth of Gold, it was still impressive. Despite the incredibly good financial situation that Henry VII had left his son, Henry VIII had very quickly depleted his father's fortune and left England in so precarious a situation that he had to find a way of rescuing England from virtual bankruptcy. Thus, Wolsey had to pay for Henry VIII's war with very limited financial resources. England signed an alliance with the Pope and the Emperor in 1522, leading to an invasion of France in which the countryside of northern France was pillaged. Surveys of taxable land, houses and valuables were sent out in 1522, scouring the English kingdom for money. Parliament was then called in April 1523. Wolsey, as Lord Chancellor, explained Henry's need for money, emphasising the treachery of the old enemy, France. He then asked for the unbelievable sum of £800,000, equivalent to 20% tax across the board. Parliament had refused this demand and remained obstinately silent. At last a subsidy of 10% was voted, but there were murmurings across the country. Wolsey boosted the grant with a massive levy of 50% of a year's income on the church, which he forced through as legate, overriding Warham. After scraping together the necessary funds, the new campaign to France in 1522-23 turned out to be a shambles. Poor conduct by British soldiers, the poor weather, and finally the fatal devastation of poor conditions led to a retreat. The Duke of Suffolk had advanced from the English base of Calais and provoked havoc in northern France, with the ultimate plan of meeting up with an imperial army to take Paris. Such a capture would have been the stuff of Henry's wildest dreams. However, the promised support did not materialise. Rather than plough on alone, Suffolk returned to Calais by December of 1523. Henry would never get as close to the French capital ever again. Suffolk was given the blame for the failings of the campaign, leading him to resent Wolsey and join the growing camp of the Cardinal's enemies. The 1522-23 campaign brought minimal success for England, but the English involvement certainly helped Charles by distracting the French, enabling him to ultimately defeat his foe at the Battle of Pavia in 1525 and capture Francis after annihilating his army. Henry, having wasted £400,000 after 3 years of fighting, then felt there was a realistic opportunity for him to seize the French crown, to which the kings of England had long laid claim. He didn't want to come out of the war empty-handed. Parliament, however, refused to raise taxes. This led Wolsey to devise the Amicable Grant in 1525, which was named amicable because it was supposed to be a friendly request for funds. However, this was met with even more hostility and ultimately led to Wolsey's downfall. The grant was essentially a forced loan without parliamentary approval. It was a levy of between 1/6 and 1/10 on the goods of the common people, and on 1/3 of the goods of the clergy. In the face of widespread opposition to funding another expensive war, Henry VIII, disappointed in Wolsey, did an abrupt about-turn. He ordered the collection of the grant money to end and claimed that it had been levied without his permission or approval, essentially shifting the blame onto Wolsey. Wolsey was disgraced and was forced to give Henry the extravagant Hampton Court Palace as penance. Wolsey would retain the right to use his former pride and joy whenever occasion demanded or time allowed. Charles had bigger plans of European domination and abandoned his English ally, which in turn led to rapprochement between England and France. The rest of Europe was now horrified at Charles's overwhelming strength, and in 1525 the Treaty of the Moor was negotiated by Wolsey, wherein England agreed to give up some territorial claims on France and in return get a substantial pension from the French. France settled what was due to Henry VIII's sister Mary, Dowager Queen of France, and England agreed to negotiate for the release of King Francis, who was being held in Spain by Charles V. England had also been threatened by the threat of a renewal of the old alliance between France and Scotland, so France made assurances about the alliance not making a comeback anytime soon. By 1525, Wolsey's only friend was the king. The nobles hated and were envious of him. Queen Catherine believed he was favouring the French over her Spanish connection. The church at home resented his financial exactions, and the Pope was not impressed by his lack of interest in keeping Rome informed of events. Wolsey was saddled in an impossibly difficult situation. He needed to obtain great sums of money for the King of England under the pretense of war. He also needed to keep the French king and the emperor in perpetual war and distrust. Neither undertaking was enviable. Yet Wolsey was also facing his most formidable and desperate task of all, the unravelling of a royal marriage that had long grown barren and cold. Emperor Charles and King Francis had been thoroughly offended by Wolsey's pride, and the only person to have a good word for him was Charles's aunt, Margaret, regent of the Low Countries, whose power was limited. But these were all known enemies. Wolsey had also crossed someone who would be far more dangerous to him, and the rest put together. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's infamous Great Matter, was now upon him. Cavendish's The Life of Cardinal Wolsey is the source for the story that Wolsey had incurred Anne's enmity in 1523 by breaking off her romance with Henry Percy, heir to the Earl of Northumberland. According to Cavendish, this had been instigated by the king himself, but Anne vowed revenge on the cardinal. If she did, he no doubt dismissed it as angry talk by a mere girl. Wolsey reasoned that if the Queen could not influence her husband against him, what chance did Anne have? By 1525, Henry VIII had fallen in love with Anne. He said that he was struck with the dart of love and, before long, was planning to marry her. Boleyn was smart and conniving, and Wolsey had underestimated her influence over Henry. It was also the case that by 1525 it was clear for all to see that Queen Catherine of Aragon's childbearing days were over, and to worsen matters, her political power had been diminished as the Anglo-Imperial alliance foundered hopelessly. In short, she had become a tiresome irrelevance in all but her ability to impede her husband's plans and those of the cardinal. This the Queen knew, this the Queen feared, and this she continued to resent, laying all blame, like the rest of the court, upon the king's willing scapegoat. The status quo was that both Queen Catherine and the king's new flame, Anne Boleyn, detested Wolsey. In addition to this, his many other enemies too. The clock was ticking. Wolsey took steps to secure his position. He attempted to reform the king's household by devising the Eltham Ordinance of January 1526. The ordinance, which targeted his influential opponents from the Privy Chamber, who enjoyed close access to the king, would have given Wolsey immense political power and halved the number of privy grooms from 12 to 6, but the plan did not materialise. In the ordinance, Wolsey sought to combat the great confusion, annoyance, infection, trouble and dishonour that ensueth by the members as well of sickly, impotent, inable and unmeet persons, as of rascals and vagabonds, in all the court. There were altogether too many carvers, servers, cupbearers, ushers, yeomen of the guard, and even when some officials were no more than absentee sinecurists, their servants retained the right to free board and lodging. Locks had been stolen from doors, plates had disappeared, food was left to rot upon floors, while half-filled cups and dishes were left to gather mould in darkened corners. Brawling was commonplace. The Eltham Ordinance was really above all Wolsey's last-ditch attempt to hold on to power in the face of a maturing king increasingly interested in being involved in state matters. But the ordinance would not come to pass before his downfall. Anne Boleyn was a skillful player at the game of courtly love. This may have been how she caught the eye of Henry, who was also an experienced player, and resisted Henry's infatuated attempts to seduce her, refusing to become his mistress, and often leaving court for the seclusion of Hever Castle. She insisted on a proposal first. Within a year he proposed marriage to her, and she accepted. Both assumed an annulment could be obtained within months. Henry desperately wanted a son, and argued that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, with whom he had a daughter, was not lawful. He wanted a papal dispensation to annul his marriage. The Catholic Church held the sole power to break marriages, as they were seen as contracts made under God. So he asked Wolsey to use his influence in Rome to get a papal annulment of his marriage so that he could remarry. In the mid-1520s, however, the situation was clouded by two factors. First, the spread of Lutheran ideas challenging the supremacy of the Pope. Clement VII would not be eager to add fuel to these notions by suggesting his predecessor had been wrong to grant the dispensation under which Henry and Catherine were originally married. The second obstacle was the sack of Rome by Emperor Charles's forces in May 1527, which resulted in the Pope becoming his prisoner. And lastly, Charles V was Catherine of Aragon's nephew, so was related to her and was ready to support her no matter what. It was this combination of factors and bad luck which put Henry in such a predicament. Wolsey tried to turn this situation to his advantage by travelling to Avignon in France in a bid to be recognised as the Pope's regent, able to act for him while he was in bondage. However, he was circumvented, both by Catherine smuggling a letter out to Charles V and by the immediate efforts of his enemies at home to undermine him as soon as he was out of the country. The king was persuaded by Anne's faction, which combined Anne's relatives with Wolsey's enemies, her uncle the Duke of Norfolk, her father Sir Thomas Boleyn, and Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, being the ringleaders, to send messengers directly to Rome. The Pope allowed Henry to put his marriage on trial in England. The Pope sent a representative, Cardinal Campeggio, to give joint judgment on the marriage with Wolsey. Clement dared not offend his captor Charles V, who was Catherine of Aragon's nephew, and Campeggio had already received instructions not to proceed to sentence under any pretext without express commission, and to protract the matter as long as possible. The Italian Campeggio, who himself disliked Wolsey, exploited every opportunity to loiter and obstruct. It was slow diplomatic strangulation. Acting under strict instructions from Pope Clement, he even used his gout as a convenient excuse for his slowness. Unable either to walk or ride, he hobbled along a purgatory of unpaved roads and stifling summer heat, moving slowly across Europe. Villagers who caught sight of him along the way saw only a shrunken figure, hunched in pain with a long untrimmed beard. This deliberately laboured journey meant further delay and further opportunity for some unforeseen development which might somehow release the Pope from the Gordian knot currently binding him. In 1529, Wolsey's famous legatine court opened at Blackfriars to try the case of matrimony between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. After some opening legal business, Catherine famously appealed to her husband in person, then refused to accept the authority of the court, appealing directly to Rome. Clement was horrified, but unable to resist the pressure of the emperor, who now controlled Italy, removed the authority of the Blackfriars court. On 31st of July 1529, Wolsey was obliged to stand up in court and tell the king that his case was not concluded, but must be decided in Rome instead. After months of deliberations, the Pope had ultimately refused to grant Henry his annulment. Pandemonium broke out. Charles V called Henry's involvement with Anne an ugly affair and became committed to Catherine's cause. "Nothing shall be omitted on my part to help you in your present tribulation," he told her, and to confirm his promise he followed her suggestion and urged the Pope to revoke Wolsey's legatine power, which would leave him powerless in the matter of the marriage. Much to his dismay, Wolsey had learned that the king had enjoyed supper in his privy chamber with his enemies the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk, the Marquess of Exeter and Sir Thomas Boleyn. Given Henry's susceptibility to influence and proneness to whim, the possibilities were obvious. It was one of the cardinal's residing superstitions that his fall would be brought about by a woman, and now his worst fears were being realised. Henry had been suspicious for some time, owing to the seeds of doubt planted by Anne and her supporters, that Wolsey was not as diligent in pursuing the annulment as Henry required. Wolsey was framed as delaying the process, and the ultimate failure of his legatine court seemed to support that fear. Henry was not, however, certain that he could, or should, try to manage without Wolsey. He also remained personally attached to the cardinal for the time being. The final blow to Wolsey's efforts came in 1529 when the French made peace with Charles. Meanwhile, the French also continued to honour the old alliance with Scotland, stirring up hostility on England's border. With peace between France and the Emperor, there was no one to free the Pope from Charles, who had effectively held Pope Clement VII captive at sword point since the sack of Rome. There was thus little hope of securing Henry VIII's annulment from his marriage to Charles's aunt, Catherine of Aragon. From 1527, Wolsey's desire to secure an annulment for his master had dictated his foreign policy, and by 1529, none of his endeavours had succeeded. In October, Wolsey was indicted on a Praemunire Charge of having overstepped his legatine authority. On the 18th of October, he surrendered the Great Seal. Stripped of all his offices except York, he left London for York in April of 1530. Before leaving for York to his last remaining office as Archbishop of York, he had first gone to his palace at Esher. En route, he was met by Sir Henry Norris with a ring from the king. Grateful beyond words, Wolsey sank to his knees in the road, thanking the king for his kindness, which he reciprocated by sending his fool, Patch, to the king's service. Much to Patch's displeasure, he had to be taken by force. Henry again sent positive messages in November before Parliament opened, but Wolsey's enemies were baying for his blood, and the Lords introduced a bill to prevent Henry ever employing him again in public office. The bill contained an enormous list of mainly ludicrous charges, including embezzlement, putting the cardinal's hat on the coinage, referring to himself in the same sentence as the king, and endangering the king's health by breathing infection on him. Wolsey was defended in the Commons by his secretary, Thomas Cromwell, and the bill was dropped. In the new year of 1530, Norfolk continued his assault, but when Wolsey fell seriously ill, Henry exclaimed that he would not lose him for £20,000 and sent his own doctors, as well as another ring. He also persuaded Anne to send a token of esteem. Nevertheless, the pressure from Norfolk, Suffolk, Boleyn, and the rest was unrelenting. It was now a fight to the death. If Henry re-established Wolsey in his favour, they could not hope to survive. The council, unable to persuade Henry to completely abandon him, went along with a full pardon on the 12th of February, together with banishment to reside in his archbishopric of York. Wolsey pleaded poverty and attempted to persuade the French and imperial courts to send the arrears of pensions promised many years before. Henry too sent him £1,000. In April, he began his journey north. He remained at the archbishopric's house at Southwell for some months, living more extravagantly than was wise, in direct contravention of Cromwell's advice. Always busy, Wolsey occupied his time in his diocese, acting more in conformity with his vows as a priest than ever before, dispensing charity, confirming children and saying Mass. He had never actually been enthroned as Archbishop, so despite needing the king's consent, which he neglected to ask for, he sent out summons to the Northern Convocation of Clergy to attend his enthronement on the 7th of November 1530. This, together with the information that a papal bull threatening an excommunication had been published, was enough to allow Henry to be persuaded that Wolsey was guilty of presumptuous, sinister practices. He was accused of treason and ordered to London by Henry Percy, 6th Earl of Northumberland. On 1st of November, a warrant was issued for his arrest. On 4th of November, Wolsey was arrested on the charge and carried towards London. By Saturday 26th of November, he was at Greyfriars Abbey, Leicester. He had been getting sicker all the while and had hit his head in an accident, and, tumbling from his mule, told the abbot, "I am come hither to leave my bones among you." He died on the 29th of November 1530, uttering the famous last words, "I see the matter against me how it is framed, but if I had served God as diligently as I had done the king, he would not have given me over in my grey hairs." He was buried with full honours and regalia in Leicester Abbey Church, close to the grave of Richard III, without the grand sarcophagus he commissioned for his own use. Henry VIII contemplated using Wolsey's impressive black sarcophagus for himself, but Lord Nelson now lies in it in the crypt of St Paul's Cathedral. Henry often receives credit for artistic patronage that properly belongs to Wolsey. Despite Cavendish's clear account of the Archbishop of York being buried in the Lady Chapel, the exact location of his tomb remains a mystery. No one has yet been able to find his body. There have been several attempts to locate Wolsey's lost tomb in both the 19th and 20th centuries, when extensive digs were carried out on site. But in the end it was his servant Cavendish who gave him his lasting monument, and thus ended the life of my late lord and master, the rich and triumphant legate and Cardinal of England, on whose soul Jesu have mercy. Amen.